Good morning, everyone. We will be starting our webinar shortly. We'll give another couple of minutes for attendees to join us. Meanwhile, I would like to introduce these slides that you're seeing on the screen to introduce our Direfuse project. We have some upcoming webinars and workshops. There are links to our website, so I'll strongly encourage you to go ahead and start subscribing to our webinars and our workshops by following the links that are provided here. We'll give another couple of minutes for attendees to join in, and then we'll introduce our speakers for today. Good morning, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon from wherever you're joining. Thank you for joining us for the first webinar series of the Direfuse project. Direfuse is sponsored by the United States National Science Foundation Sustainable Regional Systems Research Network grant, and it stands for Disaster Resilient Food, Energy, Water Systems. We strongly encourage you to visit our website. You must have seen the website's link in the initial slides. If not, we can be found at tx.ag/direfuse. Our first webinar is very important to start the stage and set the stage for the discussions that we are going to have over the next year. Our first webinar is on disasters and their management. So before we go into resilience in food, energy, water systems, with the perspective of disasters, it is very important for us to know how the disasters are managed. And we are very grateful for perspectives from the Texas Division of Emergency Management today. Our discussions today are going to be led by McGregor Stephenson, who has kindly agreed to join the call today. He's the Chief of Policy and Research for Texas Division of Emergency Management. And with us also today, we have Carly Smith, Section Chief of the Disaster Recovery Task Force. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mac to take the stage and lead the discussion.
Thank you very much, Evelina. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all this morning and kind of give the 50 to 100,000 foot view of how disasters are managed statewide in Texas. And obviously with the partners in Mississippi and Louisiana, there's a variation in their local systems and how they operate as well. But for Texas, this is the process that we use and the mechanism. And so what I'm going to do now is go ahead and share my screen so that you can see my slides, and we'll get started. And the Texas Division of Emergency Management is actually a member of the Texas A&M University system. We are one of 8 state agencies that are operating under the A&M system and under the Board of Regents. And so we are in somewhat of a unique position compared to a lot of emergency management agencies in that we do have the direct connection to higher education. But in terms of our authorization, the key statutes for us start at the federal level with the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, and then flow down, and we have Chapter 418 in the Texas Government Code, which deals directly with emergency management and the division. Chapter 421, which is Homeland Security, which is a shared venture between DPS and TDEM. And then Chapter 433, the Texas Government Code for State of Emergencies, which deals with the declarations of emergency and disaster at various levels. There is also Executive Order number GA05, which Governor Abbott put in place in December of 2018 and addresses emergency management and the Emergency Management Council. And then Title 37 of the Texas Administrative Code, Chapter 7, regarding emergency management. And as I said, we're part of the Texas A&M University system, and so operate within the guidelines set out by Board of Regents policy and system regulations. Now, within Texas, TDEM is responsible for a comprehensive state emergency management program. We handle planning, training, exercises, response, recovery, and mitigation. And the chief of the division, Chief Nim Kidd, is appointed by and serves at the pleasure of governor and must be confirmed by the Senate. He also serves as Vice Chancellor for Disaster and Emergency Services within the A&M system, and so works with across multiple agencies for that role. Primarily, as I hope everyone is aware, every disaster begins and ends at the local level. Emergency management relies on integration of emergency management plans across all governmental entities and non-governmental entities, individuals, and community organizations. And so requests for assistance always start at the local level. And we try to work with local governments and local entities to make those responses as coherent and rapid and relevant as possible. So, sorry. So, according to state law, a local emergency is any occasion or instance that you can see listed there that warrants action to save lives and to protect property and public health and safety. So it is not just about saving lives, it is about property and safety as well. Under state law, a disaster is the occurrence or imminent threat of widespread or severe damage, injury, or loss of life or property resulting from a similar list, but a little bit more extensive because it does get into hostile military actions and droughts, which emergencies are not included in that definition. So under Chapter 418 of the Texas Government Code, which is the Texas Disaster Act of 1975, TDEM, it was put in place to reduce the vulnerability due to natural or human-made incidents, rescue, care, and treatment of persons victimized or threatened by disasters, provide the rapid and orderly restoration and rehabilitations of persons and property affected by disaster, clarify and strengthen the roles of all levels of government, and to set out the prevention of, preparation for, response to, and recovery from events, emergencies, and disasters. It also authorizes and provides for cooperation in those various response and recovery activities across all levels of government. We also ensure coordination of activities relating to these various aspects, and we provide an emergency management system embodying all aspects of preparedness and response. We assist in the mitigation of disasters, so doing our best to try and identify ways that we can reduce the impacts of disasters on the public and on governmental entities as well, trying to, prior to an incident taking place, find ways that we can reduce the impact. And then finally, we provide the authority and mechanism to respond to an energy emergency. And that was something that was recently added. One of the key aspects in the ways that we do coordinate across all state agencies and impacted entities is through the Emergency Management Council. And the council provides advice and assistance with respect to response operations. When activated, it convenes at the State Operations Center and also local through the disaster district coordinators or disaster district councils for district and regional members. They meet out in the districts under the Department of Public Safety district level managers. And so they carry out state response activities for major emergencies and disasters. They are mandated by executive order to advise and assist the governor in all matters relating to disasters. And they have the legal responsibility, expertise, or resources needed when we have to respond to an emergency or disaster. The individual members of the Emergency Management Council have to have the operational decision-making authority so that when we're in a crisis situation, they can define the actions that their agency is going to take and follow through with that implementation. So there are currently 39 state agencies on the Emergency Management Council and who provide representatives. In 2018, the governor added additional agencies, including the 6 university systems. And so the Texas A&M University System and UT System and the others are also part of the Emergency Management Council. So the specific duties for each member of the council is designated in the State Emergency Management Plan and annexes, which are prepared, developed, and maintained by TDEM. The head of the agency designates one or more staff members from the agency to serve on the council and to fulfill the roles required under the State Emergency Management Plan. And under the approval of the governor, they request the chair, the chief of TDEM, may request services from other relevant state agencies on matters relating to the council. So the way all of the state agencies operate is within the framework of emergency support functions, and they provide a structure for coordinating interagency support for response to an incident. And the mechanisms for grouping functions are for those that are most frequently needed to respond to disasters and emergencies. So the emergency support functions are listed there on the left-hand side of the screen and include transportation, communications, public works and engineering, firefighting, emergency management, mass care management, logistics management and resource support, public health and medical services, search and rescue, oil and hazardous materials, agriculture and natural resources, energy, public safety and security, cross-sector business and infrastructure, which is a new one, public information, recovery, which is new. Before, this had been primarily focused on the response aspect, and so ESF 16 was added to meet that additional demand. The military, which is also a new ESF, and higher education, which is a new ESF, along with operations technology. So all of those functions you can see on the right-hand side here that there is a lead state agency that's responsible for each of those aspects. And so for any particular crisis, if it is a search and rescue crisis, then Texas A&M Engineering Extension Service is the lead on that and takes the lead role for responding in that area. One of the other aspects of emergency management that we work with is the Emergency Medical Task Force. These are mobile medical units and resources that are able to activate and be dispersed throughout the state to respond to crises that local requirements cannot meet. And the key to the program is the ability to activate our members. In other words, the people, the staffing for the Emergency Medical Task Force comes from local EMS and fire departments, public and private health organizations, regional coalitions, and state and local government who provide personnel and assets that activate during disasters. So this truly is the tiered response effort for medical purposes. The next aspect is the Texas Intrastate Fire Mutual Aid System, or TIFMAS, and TIFMAS is maintained by the Texas A&M Forest Service and they coordinate responses to fire outbreaks, including wildfires and all of the drought-related fires that we have experienced, and also can be used in other types of crises when we need additional resources from the local level to respond to a statewide incident. And so the program was first used during Hurricane Ike and has been mobilized for the Presidio flooding, wildfire outbreak, Hurricanes Alice and Harvey. And then it has also been used to respond and provide assistance out of state for the California wildfires in 2018 and 2020. And so the call up comes from the state, and resources are assigned from local jurisdictions to TIFMAS, and then those resources are allocated under the state response. So as I said at the beginning, all disasters are local, and so we start the response at the local level. When the local level cannot manage the response through their efforts and through their mutual aid agreements with nearby jurisdictions, it gets bumped through the disaster district committee to the state level. And at that time, then we begin assigning state resources to go in and provide additional assistance at the local level. When the state is overwhelmed due to the scope of the event, then it becomes an issue where the state requests assistance through FEMA and gets the additional resources, hopefully from the federal government. So one of the key aspects for us is keeping the information flowing from the council and other state agencies to ensure that the governor, lieutenant governor, speaker of the House are kept up to date on critical matters relating to emergency management. And that is so that when we're putting out information, that it is a clear message from across all levels of state government, and so that we have a clear message from everyone. So as I said, assistance flows starts at the local level, and the local level will respond to the emergency at that point. And they will, if they cannot meet it with their own resources at the local jurisdiction, they can request mutual aid from other jurisdictions close to them. They may also seek assistance from the voluntary organizations active in disaster, or VOAD, and the private sector for additional assistance. When that does not meet the needs of the emergency or the disaster, then the disaster district committee comes into play. They review the situation, and then the local jurisdiction can request additional support through the disaster district committee, which comes to the state operations center. This is just a map of the state of Texas and shows all of the disaster, or the district coordinators and the districts that are assigned across the state, and where the resource requests would come from and through whom they would flow. So the primary mechanism for requesting assistance is the State of Texas Assistance Request, or STAR form. These are submitted by governmental entities and go through the Disaster District Committee for review, and then to the State Operations Center for review and approval and implementation. And so again, everything flows from the local level up to the state level in terms of requesting assistance outside of what's available at the local level. Here you can see a picture of the State Operations Center during an activation. All of these tables are managed by the various state agencies and by TDM staff. There are also FEMA representatives that are located in the SOC to handle coordination between the state and federal levels. And so, there are also voluntary organizations active in disasters that are assigned to the SOC, as well as private entities that have contracts to support us during disasters. So the State Operations Center, as we just showed, coordinates the emergency management activities, activation and deployment of state resources, and reviews the requests from the DDCs. They may also request interstate mutual aid or federal assistance. So the Federal Emergency Management Agency sets the threshold for which public assistance may be received by a state. In order to reach the level needed to get public assistance from the federal government, the state of Texas has to be able to show $47.5 million in damage from one event. So in order for us to trigger that federal assistance under the public assistance program, there has to be a clear showing that the damage exceeded that level. Each county within that 47.5 million has an individual county threshold that must also be met for them to be eligible under the program. So just because the state meets the $47.5 million threshold doesn't mean that an individual county will then become eligible for public assistance. And on the TDM website, you can look and see what the various thresholds are at the county level. So since 1953, the top 10 major disaster declarations across the country, with California being number 2 at 100, and of course Texas number 1. And sometimes there's not a good reason to be number 1. But since 1953, we've had 102 major disaster declarations. We've had 18 emergencies and 243 FMAGs. And so that ends up being about 1 every 8 months. So that is quite an overwhelming amount and involves a lot of work and effort when there's a major disaster declaration. So if it goes beyond the level of the state's ability to respond to it, the governor can request assistance through the Stafford Act, and the governor's request is made through the FEMA regional administrator based on the findings that the disaster is such magnitude and severity that it is beyond the ability of the state to respond effectively and affected all levels. That's kind of my portion of it, but I did want to get in one quick plug. TDM recently took over the publication, the Domestic Preparedness Journal, and that's at domesticpreparedness.com. It is a journal for practitioners and primarily written by practitioners to provide developments on emergency preparedness, disaster response, and resiliency to first responders, health professionals, emergency managers, etc. And it provides the website provides articles for a variety of the backgrounds and covers all aspects of disaster preparation and response. And so I just wanted to give you all the opportunity to get a look at that as well. And finally, if you have any questions regarding research, you can always reach me at mcgregor.stevenson@tdm.texas.gov. And at that point, I will turn it back to Dr. Sengupta.
Thank you, Mac, for the comprehensive overview of TDM's activities. If you allow us, we have a poll that we are going to start now just to get some of the information from the participants. We know that you're joining us from many regions, not only in Texas, but also around the world. So we just would like to activate the poll now so that you can give us a feel of where you're joining us from. While we are doing that, I would also like to say if you have questions for Mac, please leave them in the chat. We will be working on through those questions at the end of the talk, after Carly's talk. So we welcome any questions, any comments, any requests for information that we can get while we have Mac and Carly on our webinar today. So we'll also, Mac, if you want to leave the slide with the QR code on the journal for a few more minutes while we run the poll. We are about 70% through the poll, so if you wanted to leave that on for a few more minutes, you could do that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, we would like to again encourage you to show your participation by letting us answer those 2 questions in the poll. And I think we have about 72 of the participants who have entered our poll. So thank you very much. If we can now, I think we can end the poll in a couple of seconds. And let me share the results. So we have about a maximum participation for today's webinar from Texas. We also have from Louisiana, Mississippi, and West Bengal in India. These are the regions that we intend to cover through our national and international partnerships to bring in different perspectives for a convergent research program that Direfuse intends to build. Also, the focus on Direfuse is to build technology that can help alleviate disasters in the disaster management cycle of response, recovery, preparedness, and mitigation. So that is our primary focus, to help build technology towards disaster resilience. Again, if you're interested to join or participate in the program from the National Science Foundation, please kindly subscribe to our program through the subscription page that has been sent in the chat. And we'll be happy to connect with you for future engagement opportunities. With that, I think now is a good segue to go into Carly's talk, and we can continue with you, Carly.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And the segue into my first slide or so was very timely. So I kind of wanted to pick up a little bit where Mac left off, but where I was talking about that segue is going into the general fundamentals of emergency management and the emergency management cycle. So obviously we have preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. Those are the core components that make up emergency management. And I'd say overall, emergency management as a profession is still fairly new. The focus in emergency management has been in the past heavily weighted on response components, especially given that emergency management as a profession was usually in other duties as assigned to the first responder community. So you might have a law enforcement officer who also served in the emergency management function, or a fire chief who also served as the emergency management coordinator. But overall, the profession really hasn't come into development outside of the last decade or so. And so the focus on some of those other divisions has been lacking. We're thankful to be under the A&M system now and be able to really focus a lot of our efforts on recovery and mitigation and preparedness activities, especially with the support of the Emergency Management Council partners and our higher education partners as well. We have a saying in TDM that every day is recovery day, and that's really because recovery lasts for years. The response phase in a disaster, albeit very destructive, is usually very quick. And we have amazing first responders in this state that can deploy to a location and aid in those life-saving activities. But really with that transition from response into recovery, and then the longer term recovery mitigation efforts take years and years and years. And then we cycle back around to preparedness and trying to create a system of more resiliency for those local communities. I know you just saw this slide previously, but I thought it important as well to note that, again, all disasters start and end at the local level. TDM, the state agencies, the Emergency Management Council, the special response teams that can deploy to a disaster are all doing so at the request of that local jurisdiction. The state of Texas does not go into a local jurisdiction and manage their disaster independently. It is a request for assistance from that local jurisdiction. And as Mac mentioned, there are thresholds for those requests, and the local jurisdiction then has to be able to demonstrate the need. So how do you demonstrate that need? Sorry, I didn't realize that started automatically. How do you demonstrate that need? And that's with damage assessments. One of the key components in a post-disaster activity is assessing the level of damage. You really can't get a true idea of how big is big and how bad is bad, and what resources are needed, and what assets you currently have and what assets you need to request without knowing the extent of the damage. So one of the main focuses for TDM as a response to recovery entity at the request of the local jurisdictions is to aid in that damage assessment process, to get a true idea of what is out there and what resources the state of Texas or the federal government is able to provide to that local jurisdiction. So I have a quick video about some of the mechanisms of damage assessment.
When large disasters impact Texas, the Texas Division of Emergency Management, TDM, provides support for local jurisdictions. One of the most important tasks local police do after a disaster is provide information to TDM and possibly the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, about the size of the damage in their jurisdiction. This is all part of the preliminary damage assessment process. This effort drives the process in which the state may request assistance from federal partners like FEMA to aid in recovery for the community. The first step in this process is the collection of disaster summary outlines, DSO, which are filled out with identified damages and submitted by local jurisdictions to TDM. TDM validates these damages and works with both the local jurisdictions and FEMA to provide data to support the state's request for FEMA assistance. Disaster information is gathered from many different resources. Texas uses a self-reporting survey, which is a valuable tool determining the affected areas in a widespread manner. Using this data helps field staff focus their search for additional damage. Additionally, these surveys provide information such as insurance status, utility outages, and if the volunteer assistance is needed. First responders in the area are also equipped with technology that provides information on the affected area. As a special response team coordinates search and rescue operations, they also upload information on the level of damage, aiding in the identification and validation process. Rapid damage assessment teams comprise of TDM staff, partner agencies, and trained volunteers conduct door-to-door assessments to validate the self-reporting survey and identify additional properties that may have been damaged. These assessments are available to local jurisdictions and is not dependent on cellular or internet service, which at times is unavailable. Local communities can also share the data they collect directly to the Texas Data Collection Platform, also known as WebEOC, which helps ensure a whole community assessment. TDM also uses new technology such as unmanned and manned flights to collect imagery to quickly gather damage data and validate other sources. Once all this data is received, TDM reviews the accuracy of the reported damage. This new technology is helpful when areas are not easily accessed in person due to many reasons, including high floodwaters or social distancing measures required by COVID-19. The state validates the damages that are identified by local jurisdictions and provides all of the data to FEMA for review. FEMA uses this information and additional assessments to certify the damages and determine whether the state meets requirements for federal assistance. To learn more about TDM, visit tdm.texas.gov.
All right, so hopefully that gave you a little bit of the overview of the process of damage assessments and how you actually seek those additional services from the state or the federal government. TDM prides itself on being a partner to local jurisdictions in the effort to be able to obtain as many resources as are available to a local jurisdiction in aiding in their recovery process. And so we've developed some technologically advanced tools to move that process forward. We have been using a self-reporting damage survey and a first responder assessment for quite some time out in the field, but we learned real quick in the winter storm of last year, and coupled with the COVID response, that we really needed a statewide ability to collect damage information remotely. Local jurisdictions did not have the ability to send teams or first responders out to do the damage assessments themselves. The state teams were not always available especially given the limitation of travel during the last winter storm. And so we developed this platform to roll out to the state as a whole to assess not only private property damage, but then public infrastructure as well. So the two tools that we launched this last year are known as the ISTAT and the PSTAT tool. It stands for State of Texas Assessment Tool, and one of them is individually, and one of them is public property. So what you have on your screen right now is the individual assessment tool. So this is that self-reporting damage assessment that disaster survivors can submit on their own. Who knows more about their current situation and their level of damage than the actual property owner that resides in that home? We received information from many different types of disasters, from winter weather to hurricanes to tornadoes to localized flooding, and even the border event as well. So to be able to share the level of damage with the state and with their local partners, to be able to request assistance if volunteer teams are mobilized and out in the field, we can receive that information and be able to provide that over to the volunteer organization to then aid in that disaster survivors recovery on their private property. And then that aids our ability to leverage additional resources from state agencies and the federal government as well. So the classification of damage is pretty standard for an individual property. We have a matrix of questions in that survey that would lead us to the different classifications of affected, minor, major, or destroyed. I believe that you're probably all aware of FEMA assistance to homeowners, and the classification of damage has to be calculated. An assessment has to be made for that local jurisdiction to gauge the level of impact before a grant can be awarded for the recovery of that disaster for individual assistance. So data for our processes and for the federal processes are very important moving forward outside of a disaster. We additionally have the public property tool, and this is really where first responders, local government, or state assisted teams can go out and do the assessment of critical infrastructure and government-owned infrastructure in local jurisdictions. So this is where you would collect the information for the water treatment facilities, the roadways, the responders that you have out in the field, the amount of time and equipment they're using to respond to and recover from the disaster, building damage, damage to parks. That would all be classified through the PSTAT tool, and then a dollar amount assessed, all in an effort to demonstrate that that local jurisdiction and then the state of Texas has met that threshold to open up additional resources and funding streams. There are different categories of work that FEMA has designated that qualify within that public assistance grant category. So debris removal is a big one. It's difficult to quantify the amount of debris that a natural disaster can leave behind, but we've developed some tools to aid in that calculation, and then to aid in that generation of a dollar amount. Emergency protective measures are what I was talking about with the first responders, the time that they have spent either out in the field or working in the emergency operations center, the equipment that they use, any consumables they use for emergency repairs. Roads and bridges, assessing your roadways and your bridge structures for emergency repairs and then long-term repairs, water control facilities, buildings, equipment, utilities, and then another category usually consists of parks and community spaces. All this information is then categorized and displayed for statewide visibility, so we can manage our resources and our assets most effectively and be able to share the information with FEMA about how we are doing, where we are, how close are we to the threshold, and then they can start to validate the information that the locals or the specialized teams and then the state collects and passes over to FEMA. So it is a bit of an arduous process, the collection of information, but that's why we go back to every training we ever give. We talk about the need for documentation and the need to prepare the information and compile it to really show that justification for additional resources being allocated to that local jurisdiction. So when I talk about those additional resources, there are grants, and those that data collection really is that first step in turning on some of the grants that might aid in disaster recovery. But then the state of Texas also has several different assistance teams. Matt talked about a couple of them in his section. He referenced TIFMAS, the Texas Interstate Fire Mutual Aid System, where we can utilize local firefighters in a new capacity and deploy them to an affected area. EMTF, the Emergency Medical Task Force, very similarly, we would call upon local jurisdictions that have entered into an agreement with the state of Texas to be able to deploy those paramedics, medics, hospital staff, emergency responders to that affected jurisdiction. The TFS, Texas Forest Service Incident Management Team, those are specialized emergency management personnel or emergency response personnel that can aid a local jurisdiction in working in their emergency operations center and helping to provide that documentation, collect the documentation, write objectives for the next workday, and keep things more organized for that local jurisdiction to utilize after the fact on that documentation standpoint. And then Texas Task Force, you're probably most familiar with Texas Task Force 1. There's Texas Task Force 1, 2, and 3, and they have different components of search and rescue activities. But two that I think will be of most interest to this group are the Public Works Response Team. So similar to all the other special response teams, it's comprised of locally employed public works professionals. And those local jurisdictions have entered into an agreement with the state of Texas to be able to deploy their public works professionals to an affected jurisdiction and help in their damage assessment and recovery efforts moving forward. It's a great team that is managed through TEEX, and we have several hundred public works professionals throughout the state of Texas that are rostered. They come with their equipment, they come with their knowledge, they come with their passion for their profession and to help the local jurisdiction in their recovery efforts. And then the state of Texas will go and reimburse that local jurisdiction for allowing us to utilize their public works staff. And the newest, and where I'm going to focus a little bit more of the discussion, is the Disaster Recovery Task Force, which is the team that I'm a part of. We operate under the Texas Division of Emergency Management, and the DRTF, or Disaster Recovery Task Force, is that mechanism for emergency management professionals to deploy across the state of Texas. So we have amazing first responders, and many of these teams are comprised of those first responders, but we didn't really have a statewide mechanism to deploy emergency management coordinators or emergency management professionals and subject matter experts as well. And so I'll kind of go into a little bit more about that, but that is why the Disaster Recovery Task Force was created. Disaster Recovery Task Force was created out of the 87th legislative session following the Eye of the Storm report, which is the after action from Hurricane Harvey. In assessing the capabilities of local jurisdictions and assessing the needs of local jurisdictions and the state capabilities, it was determined that we really did need a group of skilled individuals that could go into a local jurisdiction and provide them guidance on not necessarily just response tactics, but in that transition from response into recovery. That was always such a gray area. And as I mentioned previously, the focus on recovery or mitigation or preparedness in that emergency management cycle wasn't as weighted heavily as the response. So that transition phase into recovery to aid in the success of the recovery efforts was kind of lacking, not only at a state level, but at a local level. And local jurisdictions then expressed a need and a desire to be able to mobilize professionals that have gone through that process before to provide guidance and provide support during disasters within their local jurisdictions. Additionally, across the state of Texas, there are several offices of emergency management that are still an other duties as assigned, or an office of one, or it might just be the county judge that serves as the emergency management coordinator. So having the staffing or the bandwidth outside of just the general understanding of the process was lacking in some jurisdictions as well. So the Disaster Recovery Task Force was created to aid in those efforts and provide support to those local jurisdictions in that transition. I kind of dub our task force the group that is after response after lights and sirens, but recovery after, or recovery before the grant dollars are allocated. So we're deploying to the affected jurisdiction usually post-storm or during storm if there's an incident that gives us a little bit of a heads up, and then providing the insight on several different response to recovery transitionary processes. So I listed out several here. Emergency operations support. So outside of what an incident management team would do, the emergency operations support that the Disaster Recovery Task Force would provide is really just working with that local emergency manager or key personnel that are task oriented and help provide guidance and insight on some of those specific tasks. Resource identification. We are kind of the catch-all for subject matter experts in different areas. So one of the examples that I give is that there was a flooding event and we needed someone to serve as an expert in how to move artifacts and paintings out of a museum that had the potential of flooding. And so we kind of are that Rolodex of the ancillary things that you don't know that you're going to need until you need them, and then how do you deploy them to a disaster, and how do you manage them, and how do you get them to that affected jurisdiction. A huge component of our team is the interaction with the VOAD community and the long-term recovery community. Mac mentioned the VOAD structure earlier, the voluntary agencies, voluntary organizations active in disaster. So those nonprofit partners that will deploy to an affected jurisdiction in a disaster and provide services that the local, state, or federal government are not able to, really aiding in the needs of the disaster survivors, operating facilities that for mass care services, for sheltering and donation management, volunteer management. So that's really a component of our team that we interact with those voluntary organizations early on and help build their capacity. We help build the capacity of long-term recovery groups to sustain resiliency in a local jurisdiction, and then aid in their recovery, in their long-term recovery. Provide disaster finance assistance. So when we go back to the documentation collection and understanding how much money a local jurisdiction is spending on a given day, we call that a daily burn rate. So when you have X amount of first responders out with X amount of vehicles and you're using X amount of consumables, what does that equate to? What is that dollar amount? How much is that local jurisdiction expending every day that might need additional state support? And then we'll obviously go into the request for federal assistance after the fact. Debris management, I touched on that a bit ago. Volunteer and donation management, assessing failed infrastructure. We partner very closely with the public works response team, but then also have building inspectors that we can call upon, local fire inspectors that we can call upon, and additional subject matter experts that can help do those assessments for local jurisdictions that might not have those resources available to them. Just manpower on the damage assessments. If you'll think back to the video when we talked about first responders or trained volunteers or personnel going out into the field and validating the self-reporting damage surveys that we collect. So that would be a component of that, but then also the drone operators and the Civil Air Patrol flying with the 3D imagery camera and collecting that information and then validating that. Long-term recovery planning, mostly with community organizations, working with the local government and then bringing the community organizations in and having them actually sit at the table and talk long-term planning for a whole community approach, and then community revitalization planning. And what is this going to do to the local economy? How are they going to regenerate their local economy? What what are the points of interest that need to be focused on first and foremost from a government side, from a community side, and then how do we bridge that gap? So over the past couple of years, we've developed some tools to help us in those efforts. So when I talk about assessing local jurisdictions and their capabilities and their community organizations that currently exist, and maybe community organizations that don't currently exist, but the local jurisdiction could benefit from, we've developed local jurisdictional portals and then county profiles as well that can provide that information to field staff, to responders, to the state agencies, and then back to the local jurisdiction as well, doing that assessment of the whole community. What types of damage have they sustained in the past? What disasters have they worked? What grants have they received? What does their county or city structure look like? What resources are available? Having all that information when you're trying to do that planning post-disaster into recovery, building resiliency is imperative. So we've spent a lot of time gathering that information for every county in the state of Texas. We've built out a profile that we have contact information and those capabilities noted. I talked about ISAT and PSAT extensively, and the debris calculator referenced that. It's an ability that we have to take either a ground assessment or aerial imagery and create an estimation of the quantification of that debris and the cost that it would take to dispose of it. A road damage estimator is clearly what it said, taking a section of roadway and assessing the dollar amount that it would cost to repair that, whether it is asphalt, a caliche, a chip seal. All of those have different dollar amounts, and when first responders go out or teams go out or local volunteers go out and help that local government entity assess the damage, they don't know, they're not engineers, they're not road engineers. And so aiding in just that estimator to be able to assess the dollar amount. Emergency tracking network is what we would utilize in an evacuation to track individuals, what shelter they respond to, what shelter or hotel they need assistance at. It's just our statewide tracking mechanism. We have a VOAD situational board. So when I talked about earlier, these volunteer organizations are amazing. They have amazing resources and assets at their disposal, and they travel all over the state and all over the country. And so receiving information on their capabilities, their activities, where they're responding, how many they're responding with, so we can pair up those local disaster survivors with the services that the VOADs can provide. A disaster reporting dashboard is a new tool that we developed for a local jurisdiction to walk them through these processes that I'm talking about. Maybe they don't need a state team coming in to assist. Maybe they just need some additional guidance or a step-by-step walkthrough of what do I do first after the disaster. And that's a mechanism for them to see the next steps and then to view in real time where they're at for their local threshold, their county threshold. We also maintain a federal funding source database that we talk a lot at TDM about FEMA's public assistance grants and individual assistance grants, because those are most well known in disaster recovery efforts, but there are a myriad of other disaster recovery grants that are allocated through other federal departments. And so making ourselves aware of those and having a basic knowledge of what resources could be out there for local jurisdictions. That way, when we do encounter an issue at a local jurisdiction and they say, we just don't have the funding to tackle this, maybe we have an avenue of support for them that they can seek by just basic knowledge of USDA grants or EPA grants or different grants that might be out there for disaster recovery and resiliency. And then I mentioned the county profiles already. So this is an example of what the county profile looks like. We maintain the demographics after the last census. Those are an automatic layer in there. And then we've built in the narrative of what disasters have affected their jurisdictions, what grants they've been allocated, what resources they have in community organizations. And then most importantly too is sharing the information of the need for a recovery group to function in all of these local jurisdictions, counties, cities, districts, regions, However, it makes sense to establish it. We have established or helped local jurisdictions establish long-term recovery groups across counties. There might just be one in a city and then a different one in a county. Whatever structure works best for that jurisdiction is what we want to be supportive. But to have a mechanism to recover and have their community recover in advance of a disaster is very important. I'll talk a little bit about why that's so imperative for me personally. I started my career at a county level government as an emergency management coordinator and experienced the worst disaster that the county had ever seen. And I did not have a long-term recovery group already established. I did not have a mechanism for my community to receive donated funds, donated labor, donated materials. And I know that I did a disservice to my community by not having that already established. There was no way that for someone with a giving heart to be able to contribute dollars or material to the rebuild of my community. And those dollars ultimately went elsewhere. And so it's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about educating local government on establishing a long-term recovery group and bridging that gap between community partners and government partners. Ultimately, the goal is to build a more resilient community. And by bridging that gap, by connecting the government side and the nonprofit side and the community side, we would be more successful in all the different facets of emergency management and the well-being at that local level. This is the image from that flooding event that I referenced earlier, my local community, and why it is that I do what I do and why I'm passionate about doing what I do and providing a service to those local jurisdictions, those disaster survivors in those communities to ultimately build a more resilient Texas. That's it for me. I'm ready for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carly, and also Mac, for such a great overview and presentation. I think this has been an extremely great learning experience for myself as well, because the only way we see you guys at work are during and after the disasters. One of the things that I've always noticed is Mac picks up the phone and gives me a call, because that's what you guys are used to be doing rather than answering emails and text messages or things like that. So thank you very much for this great overview. I will start the Q&A session with some of our questions that have come in the chat. So the first question that we are going to address is from Professor Tuhin Ghosh, who is joining us from India. As you guys know, India is in their night time now, and they are joining us at that late hour just because of the interest that we have generated. You talked a lot about response and recovery. His question is, who is responsible for mitigation and preparedness efforts? Is it the local, state, or federal level?
I'll jump in and then Carly can correct anything I say wrong. So TDEM is responsible at the state level for all four aspects of emergency management, preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. And so we handle all of those efforts and pass through federal funding to local entities for those functions. And so we provide training and assistance for all of the preparedness exercises and for the development of their local emergency management plans. And then on the mitigation side, we receive some limited funding for mitigation efforts from the federal government that are then passed through in various programs to local entities for specific projects that they have in their communities for mitigation. Carly, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that was perfect. Just to hammer it home. So the state takes care of the state, and again, the locals take care of the locals, and we provide whatever we can as far as support, guidance, and assistance to those local jurisdictions. But they're going to know their needs and their hazards more so than we are from the outside looking in. So we just provide them the tools to be able to make those assessments.
Mhm. Thank you. The next question is from Ambrose Anorio, and the question states that, does state ranking of disaster events consider geographical size of the state? Or is the state ranking of those events, because, Texas has, it's the largest state, and we have those disaster numbers that Max shared. So is it related?
I think that it probably is. I think just the scope of the geographical size does have obviously more opportunity for natural disasters to occur, but it is not, there's no norming taking place in that list. It's just an absolute number of natural disasters that have occurred over that time frame.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much. I have a few questions, so I'll let people go ahead and ask their further questions in the chat. And while we are doing that, let me ask a few questions to Carly. The first question that I have is that you have shown us some of the data that you collect and you map it on the website. So how accessible is this information? And I'm coming from a researcher's perspective. How accessible is this information? And is there a way some of that analysis of the data can be delegated to some of our researchers where they get an active live data to work with in the future? So that's an open question in terms of data availability.
So I'll say the information that's collected from that initial ISTAT and PSTAT in real time is not publicly accessible. There's critical infrastructure indicated in the PSTAT. There's homeowner information indicated in the ISTAT, and so we obviously wouldn't make that public outside of the disaster. So we utilize that in the allocation of resources. And then in a quest to receive additional assets and resources and grant dollars for that local jurisdiction. But then after that, after our phase is done, the local jurisdiction then owns that data. And so if they were wanting to seek additional assistance in how to classify it and categorize it, how to write additional opportunities or projects for mitigation purposes, that would be really that local jurisdiction, because then they're the owners of their disaster data.
Okay, and I know, like when I've talked with Texas entities, we tend to give a lot of empowerment to the local jurisdiction, so it makes sense to have that data reside with the local governance. The next question that I have for you both, Mac and Carly, you mentioned the VOADs and the LTRGs. Can you expand a little bit more on their roles and some of the organizations that have been active in the Texas region?
Sure. So we do have two VOADs specifically that sit on the Emergency Management Council. So the American Red Cross and the Salvation Army both are represented in the State Operations Center and on the Emergency Management Council. We also have Texas VOAD, which is the collective of Texas-based VOADs that has a seat in the State Operations Center as well, to be able to partner with the response entities and allocate those resources at that local jurisdiction. Texas VOAD is a great collective of those smaller voluntary organizations that can be a deployable asset, but sometimes they are just active in their home community. It really depends on how they're structured. It depends on what their mission is. It depends on what their capabilities are. But we have organizations that focus on anything from tarping roofs specifically to chainsaw teams, to operating a shelter, to allocating food and water. It kind of runs the gamut. And so the volunteer organizations and the disaster nonprofits throughout the state of Texas, throughout our country, are an amazing resource that I think was not well known to emergency management or local government outside of the past several years. And so really being able to engage those organizations, share information on the needs, and have them share information on their capabilities with us has created an amazing partnership and more of a avenue for recovery efforts, especially for those disaster survivors where government involvement on private property is obviously limited, and the use of government funds for private property recovery is limited. The VOEDs don't have those constraints, and so they have the giving heart, and they have dedicated volunteers that want to go out and help those disaster survivors where we might not be able to.
Thank you. The next question that we have in the chat is from Xiaofeng Ni, and the question says that thanks a lot for the great introduction. This came after Mac's talk. What kind of funding opportunities are available from TDEM, if any?
And I assume that is on the research aspect. What funds we provide to researchers?
Yes, I assume so too.
Okay. Those are very, very limited and isolated opportunities, I would say, and they tend to be very specific to something that needs done immediately. And so, in all honesty, we don't have any set funding for research because the vast majority of our funding obviously comes from the federal government, and the federal government funds research through its various research entities like NSF and the academies and those type of things, or it funds it directly from FEMA and provides grants from FEMA for specific research. So we don't have any set funding for research with TDEM.
And just to follow up on that question as well, the purpose of Direfuse project, we are in the planning phase of the Direfuse, but in the future we have opportunities where we can have through TDEM Direfuse partnership, we can potentially get some of these federal dollars that we are planning for to engage researchers at a wider level from the universities that we're working with to go forward in bringing some of our research expertise out into the public domain. And that is one thing that we have been mandated by this specific Sustainable Regional Systems Research Network, where we want to work with communities, with government entities such as TDEM to bring this research into the public domain and enable some of these communities which do not have that capabilities of funding, for example, for mitigation purposes or for preparedness purposes, to be able to get those research dollars working towards those entities. So that's why we are trying to build our research base, and that's where we would like you all to subscribe to this program, participate in our webinars, know more about our strengths that we're offering through these webinar series. Also, we'll be having 3 in-person workshops in Louisiana, Mississippi, and finally in Texas. Our Texas workshop is going to happen in August, 17th of August. So if you want to mark your dates, save the date, invitations will be going out to the participants of today's call very soon. So if you're interested in participating, please join our workshops to formulate the research questions that can go into the project proposal that we are going to write in the future. So one related question that I would like to start and maybe have some discussions, also if any folks from the chat are interested, you can also chime in. From the research perspective, and this is where National Science Foundation has mandated us to formulate some of the research questions. So I'll ask this directly to you. Of course, TDEM does an exceptional job in responding and recovering from disasters. However, in your perception, how can the research community and organizations like Texas A&M University, the Louisiana universities, and the Mississippi universities, how can we coordinate our research efforts so that we can help in the efforts of TDEM? What would you say some of the outstanding challenges could be for our research community to partner with? If you can give some examples of how we can do those.
Well, I'll start and then let Carly join in as well. I think there are a lot of different aspects to emergency management that are in continual need for review and support. One of those areas is in the evacuation of areas that are in the path of a disaster, whether it's hurricanes or flooding or any other type of emergency. And I think one of the challenges is that there are so many different disciplines that are impacted when you start talking about how do we get people to evacuate from an area, because it crosses transportation, it crosses psychology, it crosses sociology, it crosses social services, because you're dealing with evacuating people with significant health needs. And so having continual efforts made to try and find new and better ways to encourage folks to evacuate when it's called for, how to better evacuate specific groups, how to better communicate with those groups and organizations, from nursing homes to rehabilitation facilities and all of the types of areas where there are individuals at risk, I think is one of those areas where there's always room for improvement and there are always opportunities to do it better. I think that there are also opportunities for research for mitigation efforts in regards to what are the best technologies to use when putting in new facilities. What are the best architectural designs? What are the best engineering designs? What are the things that need to go into a building if it is going to be a resilient facility and is going to be able to withstand the types of disasters or events that may take place? What do local governments, what do state governments need to be considering when they're looking at funding these types of facilities and putting together a checklist of, here are all the things that need to be considered when you're looking at developing a new facility or mitigating damage in an existing one? Because those are always situations where we come up against, the local county may have enough money to rebuild their courthouse. They don't have enough money to rebuild it to a level that would be resilient if a similar event took place again. And that is something that can be reviewed and researched, is also how do we lower the cost of making buildings more resilient? Are there alternatives to making the building resilient in terms of creating new flood plans, new barrier technologies, those type of things that can be affected to meet those kind of needs? And so those are two examples that I'll throw out there. Carly, do you have any that you'd like to add to?
Yeah, I might just expand upon the two that you did. When we're talking about the movement of people, how do you manage the movement of people more effectively? So we're not only physically transporting evacuees from impacted areas, but now we have to decide, is congregate sheltering methodology best, or is it non-congregate? What are the challenges in a non-congregate to the disaster survivor versus the congregate? So all of those play a factor. And then how do you move them back home? And then what is the impact on that disaster survivor? So we're constantly racing the clock on evacuating and then sheltering and then getting them back home. But the challenge in getting them back home is the infrastructure there to support them living closer to their home, and they want to be closer to their home because they want to start their own process of recovery. They want to have some ownership in their recovery, and we need for them to. But how do we get them back there systematically? What is most appropriate in that delayed response back to their home jurisdiction? And then how do we physically, tangibly categorize that and move those evacuees back?
And I just want to add one other thought for the researchers, and that is the challenge that we face on the practitioner side in identifying research that could be of benefit to us, because so often articles are published in the journals, and the practitioners on the front lines who are making these decisions don't have access to academic journals. And there is no way for them to be able to get into those without paying several $1,000s just to get the access for the handful of articles that they need. And so anything that can be done to translate those academic articles into a format that is readily understandable in the lay community, not between researchers, not at the academic jargon level, but at the level where it can be understood by a local county judge, by the emergency manager, by the planning commission, so that they understand what the effect is of your research. And, you know, we pay billions of dollars in research over the last several decades that never gets to the folks that could implement that research. And I would encourage all researchers to be looking beyond the publication in the journal and ticking off that final box and saying, yep, you know, I got my publication, I'm done, and encourage you to look at how important it is that your research transcend the academic world and get into the practical world, so that we're not spinning our wheels and we're not continuing to do the same thing over and over again, but we're actually learning from your experience and your expertise. And I think that's a gap that we are continuing to try to fill, that we are continuing to try to move beyond. But promotion and tenure is a mighty thing, and very difficult to get that type of process in place and have it be recognized. And I do recognize that this isn't all on the researchers. This is also on the administrators to make sure that there is credit given for that translation from academia to practitioner.
So I think I can add to that, Mac. The National Science Foundation, who is like the academics' dream location for asking for funding, is looking in this sense to convergence research. And convergence research is trying to do exactly this, where we get together as community, as educators, as business practitioners, consultants, together to solve some of the societal challenges and try to do exactly what you are trying to bring research out into the public domain. And that's one of the areas that we are trying to focus on through this program. Just for the people on the call, we would like to say that we will be sending out calls for open source articles for a collection from one of the reputed publishers. So as we would like you to consider providing your research into open source domain, so that we can address some of the issues that Mag just talked about, that research is not very easily accessible. Research is not free to access, but also we would like to have these in the form of short concept notes where it is very easily digestible, and it can be shared with practitioners who are not really conversant in research language. But we will be coming out with those opportunities, with those activities. Also, we are trying to make these online webinars where we give different perspectives from different entities, but we will also be having a focus on technology. So we will take it out in the video format to it's going to be archived on our website. So if you're sharing the information on Direfuse with anyone in these communities, we strongly encourage you to spread the word and help them get the information in these 1.5-hour webinars that we are going to conduct. Of course, we are in the planning phase, so we want to show our expertise and strength in the technology development space, but also we want to communicate with these communities. So if you find any community leaders who are willing to join us for giving their problems to the research community, we want to have this as a two-way discussion forum so that we can directly go through you and connect with these communities for solving some of their major challenges. I have one question that I would like to put out to you. This comes from Robert Villa, and he says that there are over 200 colonias or unincorporated areas in coastal Bend that are extremely at risk. Is there a way of incorporating these areas? I'll start by saying that we can definitely look into those if you bring more information to us, but I'll also let Carly and Mac take that question.
Yeah, I can comment a little bit on the interaction that we've had with them in previous disasters. So we've leveraged the Primadoras program through Texas A&M University, and they're community health care workers that actually go into the colonias and are a trusted source of valuable information for the residents that reside there. I'm sure you're probably aware that our presence entering some of these colonias is not exactly welcome, but we come with resources and assets that they might not have previously had access to. So working through the Primadoras program to provide them the guidance and the information on what resources could be available has proven itself to be pretty effective in creating as much of a resilient community within those communities as possible. There's a lot of apprehension to government involvement in some of those areas, and so the utilization of those community health workers as that trusted source of guidance and support has been pretty successful, and we continue to leverage that moving forward.
Thank you. Another question that has come up in the chat is again coming from West Bengal in India. Just to give you a geographical similarity, West Bengal is in the coast of India, and it also has one of the largest mangrove reserves in the world, the Sundarbans. And that is, again, similar vulnerabilities exist in the disasters that they face. So Papia Guho asks, participation of locals are of immense importance during the disaster recovery. Can we get insight that there is any available training models so as to train locals beforehand so that they can act accordingly during recovery?
Absolutely. So we do offer a whole suite of recovery-centric training through TDM and then also through FEMA. And then the group that I'm a part of really focuses more on that just-in-time training. So there are awareness level courses and advanced level courses and everything in between through Texas, through TDM. You can go to preparingtexas.com, preparingtexas.com, and we will have several different offerings, not only for preparedness activities, for recovery, for mitigation and response. There are also some discipline specific for other emergency services trainings that are offered through that site as well. And then we've made some just-in-time PowerPoints and some just-in-time training videos of, okay, maybe you didn't go through the 40-hour debris management course, but these are the snippets of information that you really need to see yourself be successful in this endeavor, and then reaching out for guidance and support from any of the disaster recovery task forces is available to them as well.
Okay, thank you, Carly. And maybe I can follow up with you and get some of those links to be shared in the outcomes that we prepare for this webinar. We can put those links in our live website.
And if I could just add one aspect to this, and Carly mentioned the training that FEMA does as well. And one of the stakes that the federal government put in the ground several years ago was the development of the Incident Command System and the National Incident Management System. And that gives everyone across states and local governments a common structure within which they can operate. And having that foundation does give everyone at least some passing understanding of how we are going to be organized during a response. And that can be very critical, especially when you're dealing across large geographic areas and with high population density, and you're dealing across multiple jurisdictions. Having common nomenclature is critical when the response takes place, when the disaster happens. Because if everybody doesn't understand the language and understand the process that is going to be used to respond to that disaster, then you're going to potentially be working at cross purposes, or at least, at the very least, duplicating effort in many aspects. And so having some of that training in place across geographic areas and across jurisdictions is a very good component and a good place to start.
Thank you, Mac, for that guidance. And we always want to have those nomenclatures in place so that people understand the same language. I will go ahead and ask one last question before we end today's discussion. And this is tying back to our focus area of disaster resilient food, energy, water systems. Because our focus here is on food, energy, and water needs. So Lucy Marcamacho, who is a co-PI on this project, and she's from Texas A&M Kingsville, a community which is very much vulnerable to these disasters, hurricanes and flooding and high storm surges. She asks, how do you manage the need and distribution of food and water in disaster events? And what type of help do you need from us that we can provide to make these more streamlined?
So the delivery of food and water in a disaster varies based on the need for that local jurisdiction. Kind of going back to we don't insert ourselves if not asked for assistance. So sometimes there are events that a local jurisdiction has the capacity to serve, and sometimes that there's not. So we have established a statewide feeding task force, and it's comprised of several different food bank partners, as well as volunteer organizations and nonprofits that aid in not only the movement of food products, but the cooking and serving of food product as well. So I talked a bit about American Red Cross and Salvation Army sitting on our Emergency Management Council, but there are many other partners. HEB is a huge one that has food trucks and kitchens that can mobilize to a local jurisdiction at the request of the locals or at the request of the state agency. We have a supply of meals ready to eat and bottled water staged throughout the state at some of our regional staging areas that we can allocate to that local jurisdiction if the need arises. And typically we utilize either volunteer organizations, or if the event is large enough, the State Guard in the distribution of that food and water in points of distribution methodology, which is, we refer to them as pods. So residents can drive through and pick up water and food as they deem necessary. So there are some different systems in place and different methods in place, but it goes back to that partnership between local jurisdictions, state partners, and volunteer organizations.
Thank you, Carly. And we have about a couple of minutes left, so I will take this opportunity to thank you again, Mac and Carly. Thank you for being engaged. Thank you for giving us the constant guidance in how we can make DIREFU successful for the course of the planning phase and then bring the full scale of the grant to Texas A&M so that we can help serve some of these communities who are in great need in our local regional perspective of Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. I will leave with the slides that we were running in the beginning so that if people have not caught the QR codes for our subscription page and the website, we will be recording the videos and archiving them with necessary information, relevant information from the organizations. So please visit those at a later time if you want to get back to the information that Mac and Carly has so graciously provided us with. And I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much.
Yes, thank you.